Welcome to Books and More, the channel where we explore timeless works that have shaped the human story. Today, we journey into the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, a monumental masterpiece of historical writing. With its sweeping narrative, sharp intellect, and profound reflections on power, virtue, and decay, Gibbon's work remains one of the greatest achievements in literature. Join us as we uncover the rise, the glory, and the eventual collapse of one of the world's most extraordinary civilizations. Chapter 6: The Death of Severus, the Tyranny of Caracalla, and the Usurpation of Macrinus. The sixth chapter marks one of the most turbulent transitions in the history of the Roman Empire, a shift from the stern strength of Septimius Severus to the destructive passions of his son Caracalla, and finally to the brief, uncertain rule of the usurper Macrinus. In recounting these events, one sees how a single dynasty, born from military vigor, eventually collapsed under the weight of its own brutality and ambitions. Severus, after decades spent strengthening Rome's frontiers and ruling with iron discipline, reached the end of his days far from the capital, in the cold lands of Britain. Although his body had grown frail, his spirit remained unbroken. Even on his deathbed, he sought to preserve what he had built. Yet the legacy he passed to his sons was already poisoned by the rivalry he had never managed to extinguish. His final advice, be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and care nothing for anyone else, was not the wise maxim of a statesman, but the fatal confession of a soldier-emperor who believed power rested solely in the hands of armed men. It would see the tragedies that followed. Caracalla and Geta, who were intended to rule jointly, could barely endure each other's presence. They divided the imperial palace with walls, lived with separate guards, kept distinct courts, and transformed their father's empire into an invisible battlefield of suspicion and hatred. The empire waited anxiously, knowing the peace could not last. Indeed, Caracalla soon resolved the conflict in his usual manner, through bloodshed. Under the guise of reconciliation, he lured Geta into their mother Julia Domna's chamber and had soldiers cut him down as she struggled to shield her younger son. The murder cast a shadow over the empire darker than any foreign threat. Rome had seen fratricide before, but seldom so cold and calculated. Caracalla's next actions revealed a ruler driven as much by paranoia as by ambition. He unleashed a sweeping purge against anyone suspected of loyalty to Geta, friends, servants, senators, and entire households. Thousands died. The air of terror was so thick that even silence became dangerous. Yet behind this cruelty stood a ruler desperate to maintain the image of a victorious general. In foreign affairs, he cultivated a self-image modeled on Alexander the Great. He adopted the Macedonian dress, visited shrines connected to the ancient conqueror, and marched his troops through the same lands, not out of strategic necessity but out of vanity. His campaigns in the East blended treachery and slaughter. He invited Armenian nobles under the pretext of negotiation, only to massacre them. He courted the Parthians as allies, then turned on them with needless brutality. These acts won him neither victory nor respect, only the disgust of nations he claimed to subdue. His domestic policy, however, left a more enduring mark. The Antonine constitution, which extended Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire, transformed the political identity of Rome. Though likely motivated by a desire to increase tax revenue and consolidate authority, it nonetheless dissolved the distinction between conqueror and conquered. What had once been an Italian prerogative became the shared right of millions. Yet even this significant reform could not cleanse the stain of his tyranny. Caracalla's reign grew increasingly unstable. His temper, once fierce, became ungovernable. His fear of conspiracies made him dangerous even to his closest associates. Among those who trembled under his rule was Macrinus, the Praetorian prefect. Intelligent and cautious, Macrinus perceived that his own life hung by a thread. Rumors suggested Caracalla had begun to suspect him. For a ruler accustomed to eliminating threats, suspicion alone was enough. Forced to choose between death and treason, Macrinus chose the latter. During Caracalla's journey to the temple near Carrhae, a soldier recruited by Macrinus approached him under a false pretext, then suddenly drew a dagger and killed him. The emperor who had shed so much blood died without ceremony, abandoned by those who once served him. His fall reflected the nature of his rule, violent, solitary, and devoid of dignity. With Caracalla dead, the army proclaimed Macrinus emperor. His accession marked a turning point, for he was not of senatorial rank and had no imperial lineage. This fact, more than any policy, weakened his position. Still, Macrinus attempted to stabilize the empire. He made peace with the Parthians, negotiated an end to the costly Eastern War, and sought to reduce the enormous military expenses Caracalla had left behind. But the reforms he undertook, particularly the reduction of soldiers' wages, earned him the hatred of the very force that had made him emperor. Simultaneously, in Syria, the Severan dynasty stirred once more. Julia Maza, sister of Julia Domna and grandmother of the young priest Elagabalus, used her wealth and influence to ignite a rebellion. She persuaded the legions that her grandson was the secret son of Caracalla, a fiction readily embraced by soldiers longing for the lavish rewards they had enjoyed under the Severan rulers. With the banner of dynasty raised again, troops across the east defected, and Macrinus suddenly found himself facing an army fighting not only for ambition but for vengeance. He attempted resistance but lacked the resolve of a seasoned general. His armies were defeated, and he fled the battlefield disguised, only to be captured shortly after. His death was swift. Thus ended a reign so brief that it barely left a mark, except to illustrate once more how fragile imperial power had become. In this age, the empire's ruler was no longer decided by law or merit, but by the restless whims of soldiers. The chapter closes on a somber truth. The empire that Severus had made strong through military discipline was now enslaved by that same force. Caracalla's cruelty had shattered the moral foundations of the dynasty, and Macrinus's cautious prudence proved useless in a world ruled by violence and impatience. Rome had entered an era where emperors rose through the sword and fell just as quickly. The stability once preserved through virtue and restraint was now lost, replaced by instability that grew more dangerous with each succession. Chapter 7: The Tyranny of Maximin, the Provincial Revolt, the Civil Wars, and the Death of Maximin. The seventh chapter unfolds one of the darkest and most chaotic intervals in the Roman Empire's long descent, a period in which the throne fell into the hands of a man who embodied neither Roman virtue nor political wisdom, but raw military strength. Maximin, the first emperor drawn entirely from the ranks of the common soldiers, rose to power not through lineage or merit, but through the brute force of an army grown accustomed to deciding the fate of emperors. His reign marks the moment when the empire ceased even to pretend that legitimacy came from the Senate or the people. Instead, power belonged to whoever commanded the loyalty of men with swords. Maximin's ascent began in a climate of discontent. The military, dissatisfied with the refined but unpopular Severan court, desired a ruler who appeared strong, simple, and close to their own origins. Maximin, a man of immense physical stature and a lifetime of brutal service on the frontier, seemed to fit this ideal. The soldiers hailed him emperor, and in doing so, they bypassed the Senate entirely. This act, shocking to Roman tradition, set the tone for his entire reign. The emperor owed his crown to the army alone, and thus he governed solely in the army's interests. Yet once in power, Maximin revealed the limitations of a man formed not by statesmanship but by the hardships of military life. Suspicion consumed him. He saw in the Senate only potential traitors, and in the aristocracy a class of men who resented his humble birth. Driven by fear and resentment, he unleashed waves of executions and confiscations. Noble houses were stripped of their wealth, not only to punish those who opposed him, but to finance the vast military machine that sustained his rule. His government, deprived of balance and counsel, degenerated into tyranny almost immediately. Maximin spent little time in Rome, preferring the frontiers where he felt more secure among soldiers. From there, he launched aggressive campaigns against the Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine, campaigns meant to demonstrate his prowess and justify his elevation. Though he won victories, they were purchased at great cost. To fund these wars, tax burdens increased across the empire. Cities and provinces groaned under the weight of new levies. Temples were stripped, municipal treasuries emptied, and wealthy citizens targeted for forced contributions. Rome had known oppressive emperors before, but rarely one so indifferent to the economic suffering of the provinces. It was in Africa, one of the wealthiest provinces of the empire, that discontent finally erupted into open revolt. The landowners, exhausted by extortion and fearful for their lives, sought a leader under whom they might restore dignity to the empire. They found him in Gordian, an elderly noble with a reputation for wisdom and moderation. Gordian, reluctant at first, accepted the acclamation of the provincials, partly out of duty and partly out of the momentum of events too large to resist. His son, Gordian II, was appointed co-emperor. The Senate, long humiliated and terrorized by Maximin, seized the opportunity. Eager to reclaim its ancient authority, it immediately recognized Gordian and declared Maximin a public enemy. For a brief moment, Rome rejoiced. The tyranny seemed at an end, and the Senate tasted the illusion of restored power. But the joy was premature. A loyalist commander in Numidia marched against the African rebels with ruthless efficiency. In a single, decisive battle, Gordian II was killed, and Gordian I, overwhelmed by despair, ended his own life. The Senate now found itself in an impossible position. Having openly defied Maximin, it could neither retreat nor hope for mercy. The only path forward was resistance. Thus, they appointed two new emperors, Pupienus and Balbinus, men respected for their character and experience. Yet the choice, though noble in intention, revealed the Senate's distance from the realities of power. Pupienus and Balbinus mistrusted each other, and the Praetorian Guard, accustomed to men who bought their loyalty, looked upon the senatorial emperors with suspicion. Rome was divided at the very moment unity was most necessary. Meanwhile, Maximin, enraged by the rebellion, left the frontier and marched toward Italy with his army. His progress, however, was slowed by the resistance of the Italian cities, which refused him supplies and closed their gates. These acts of defiance, though small, revealed how deeply he was hated. The people would rather suffer siege than submit again to his cruelty. The decisive moment came at Aquileia, a fortified city that refused to surrender. Maximin laid siege to it, expecting a swift victory. Instead, the defenders inflicted heavy losses on his troops. Disease, hunger, and the stubborn resistance of the citizens sapped the morale of the army. The soldiers began to question the wisdom of a campaign that offered no glory, only misery. Their loyalty, purchased through fear and gold, could not withstand hardship. In a moment that became a pattern for the age, the army turned on the man they had exalted. Soldiers broke into Maximin's tent and killed him along with his son. The tyrant who had risen through force now fell by the same instrument. His death was unceremonious, his body abandoned, a fitting end for a ruler who held power only through terror. Yet the fall of Maximin did not restore stability. The Senate's emperors, Pupienus and Balbinus, proved unable to govern together. Their mutual suspicion weakened the authority they needed to control the Praetorian Guard, who had grown restless and resentful. Within months, the Guard stormed the palace and murdered both rulers. Once again, Rome witnessed the grim spectacle of its guardians becoming its destroyers. In the aftermath, the young Gordian III, grandson of Gordian I, was elevated to the throne. His youth allowed the various factions to project their hopes onto him, and his name offered a symbolic reconciliation after the tragedies in Africa. But the underlying chaos remained. The empire that had once been ruled by laws and institutions was now governed by the unpredictable will of soldiers and the ambitions of provincial armies. This chapter reveals with stark clarity the fragility of Rome in this era. Maximin's rise showed how easily the army could impose a tyrant. His fall showed how quickly such a tyrant could be destroyed. The Senate's efforts to reclaim authority exposed their weakness, while the repeated elevation and assassination of emperors demonstrated that Rome no longer had a stable mechanism for succession. In the story of Maximin and the civil wars that followed, one sees the empire caught between its glorious past and its uncertain future. The old virtues that once sustained Rome, discipline, unity, respect for law, had eroded. In their place grew fear, ambition, and division. The empire was no longer collapsing from a single blow, it was crumbling from within, piece by piece. Chapter 8. The State of Persia and the Restoration of the Sassanid Monarchy. In this chapter, the narrative turns away from Rome's internal turmoil to illuminate a formidable power rising in the east, a power that would challenge the empire more fiercely than Parthia ever had. The story of the Sassanid restoration is not merely a regional shift. It is the reawakening of an ancient civilization, the rebirth of Persian ambition, and the emergence of a rival that confronted Rome with a renewed vitality it no longer possessed. For centuries, the Parthian Empire had stood between Rome and the deeper regions of Asia. Yet despite its resilience, Parthia was a loose confederation of noble families, lacking centralized authority and weighed down by the stagnation that often follows long prosperity. Their strength in cavalry and their ability to harass Rome's eastern provinces gave them a reputation as dangerous foes. But they lacked a unifying vision. Beneath the surface, the empire was brittle, ready to crack under the pressure of bold leadership and national revival. This leadership appeared in the person of Ardashir, a Persian noble who traced his lineage to the ancient kings of the Achaemenid dynasty. In his homeland of Fars, he gathered followers, invoked the memory of Cyrus and Darius, and kindled a sense of national pride that Parthia had long forgotten. Where the Parthians ruled with detached aristocracy, Ardashir ruled with a mission. He proclaimed that Persia had been great once and must be great again, and that the gods themselves had chosen him to restore its glory. His rise was swift. One by one, the Parthian governors and nobles fell before him. His army was disciplined and loyal, motivated not only by promises of conquest, but by a vision of unity. At last, Ardashir confronted and defeated Artabanus, the Parthian king, bringing an end to a dynasty that had stood for nearly 5 centuries. Thus began the Sassanid monarchy, a new empire with an old soul, driven by the idea that it was the rightful successor of the ancient Persian world. With domestic power secured, Ardashir turned his eyes westward. To him, Mesopotamia, Syria, and Asia Minor were not foreign lands, but lost provinces of the Persian Empire under Cyrus and Darius. He believed destiny called him to reclaim them. Rome, distracted by internal weaknesses and rapid changes in rulership, appeared a fallen giant, still powerful but no longer invincible. From the moment Ardashir asserted his claims, Rome was confronted with a threat unlike any it had faced since the days of the great Eastern monarchies. His armies were not merely raiding forces, they were instruments of conquest. They advanced with discipline and purpose, fortified by a revived Persian state religion and sustained by a unified political system. Against this rising power, Rome's eastern provinces felt increasingly vulnerable. They had endured the instability of the Severan dynasty, the brutality of Caracalla, and the indecision of Macrinus. Their loyalties weakened and their defenses faltered. The first clashes between Rome and the Sassanids exposed the imbalance of the times. Roman generals, once confident and aggressive, now fought cautiously, constrained by limited resources and fearful of further rebellion among their troops. Meanwhile, the Sassanid armies moved with the assurance of a nation convinced of its destiny. Their cavalry, clad in heavy armor, thundered across the plains. Their archers, swift and deadly, spread fear before the infantry even arrived. Their kings led from the front, blending religious zeal with military ferocity. Ardashir's victories were not limited to the battlefield. His political maneuvering was equally effective. He appealed to populations long disaffected by Roman rule, offering them a restoration of cultural identity and religious traditions suppressed or ignored under Roman administration. Cities such as Hatra, strategically significant and long contested, became symbols of Rome's inability to protect its holdings. Even Nisibis, a fortress long considered the eastern bulwark of the empire, eventually fell to the pressure of the Sassanid advance. Rome's response was fragmented. While some local commanders resisted bravely, there was no unifying strategy. The empire was simply too preoccupied with its own internal crises. Frequent changes of emperors, revolts in the provinces, and the growing threat of barbarian invasions from the north. Each crisis diverted men, money, and attention away from the east. As Rome struggled to hold itself together, Persia gathered strength. The ideological contrast between the two states became increasingly stark. Rome was an empire in decline, its traditions fading, its institutions weakened, its authority challenged by both frontier armies and discontented provinces. The Sassanid kingdom was young, energetic, and confident, fueled by religious fervor and a clear sense of historical mission. To the Persians, Rome represented an empire that had usurped territories belonging to their ancestors. To the Romans, Persia became a symbol of the external threats mounting as their internal unity dissolved. In describing Persia's revival, Gibbon emphasizes that the rise of the Sassanids was not an accident but an inevitability arising from Parthia's decay. A nation, he argues, may survive poverty or even military defeat, but it cannot survive the loss of cohesion. Parthia fell not because its armies were inferior, but because its system of government left it vulnerable to internal division. Persia, under Ardashir and his successors, presented a central authority capable of long-term planning and decisive action. This new Persian empire would not simply harass Rome as Parthia once did. It would challenge Rome's right to exist as a great power. Their ambitions extended far beyond border raids. They sought the return of Asia, the capture of Antioch, and even the symbolic subjugation of the empire that had once crushed Babylon and humiliated Xerxes. Their kings believed they were engaged in a sacred struggle to restore balance between East and West, a balance they felt Rome had upset. As the chapter concludes, one sees clearly that the rise of the Sassanids represents the beginning of a new age. While Rome still possessed vast territories, magnificent cities, and impressive armies, its ability to project power had diminished. Persia, revived and unified, stood ready to reclaim its place among the great empires of the world. What followed would be a series of wars stretching over centuries, wars that tested Rome's strength and exposed the deepening cracks within its once unshakable foundations. Chapter 9: The State of Germany and the Rise of the Barbarian Nations. In this chapter, the narrative turns from the eastern threat of Persia to the vast, shadowed lands of the north, Germania, where rugged tribes, fierce in their independence and hardened by nature, were gradually becoming one of the most formidable forces shaping the destiny of the Roman Empire. Here, Gibbon contemplates not merely the geography or customs of the Germanic world, but the deeper truth that Rome, for all its power, confronted in those forests a kind of youthful energy that contrasted sharply with its own aging institutions. The Romans had long been familiar with the Germanic tribes, yet never truly understood them. Germanicus, Tiberius, and other generals had marched into Germania, winning battles but never victory. The land itself resisted conquest, endless forests, marshes that swallowed legions, and winters so harsh that no Roman system could tame them. Rome finally conceded that Germania could not and should not be absorbed. Instead, the empire erected its boundaries along the Rhine and Danube, hoping these rivers would stand forever between civilization and barbarism. Yet, behind these rivers lay not disorderly savages, but a people whose strength arose precisely from the simplicity of their lives. The Germans owned little, desired little, and feared little. Poverty and hardship had become their training, freedom their religion. They lived without cities, without marble temples, without the luxuries that softened Roman character. They possessed only their forests, their weapons, and the fierce spirit that bound a warrior to his chief. In these conditions, Gibbon finds the seeds of a vitality Rome had lost, the vitality of a nation uncorrupted by wealth. Unlike Rome, the Germans had no central authority. The region was a mosaic of tribes, Suevi, Chatti, Cherusci, and many more. each ruled by its own customs, each united only by language and the shared pride of being free. Their leaders were chosen for valor rather than birth, and their assemblies were gatherings of armed men, not senators in togas. What the Germans lacked in polish, they gained in bravery. They fought not for territory, but for honor. They cherished loyalty to their chiefs, seeing betrayal of one's leader as worse than death. This fractured world would later give rise to the Great Migrations, but even now, in the early centuries of the empire, their constant motion made them dangerous neighbors. Pressed by population growth, climate shifts, or conflict with tribes farther north, they often pushed toward Roman borders. What began as small skirmishes escalated into raids and raids into invasions. The Rhine and Danube became not defensive barriers, but staging grounds for ceaseless conflict. And as Rome weakened, the Germans grew bolder. Equally important is the moral comparison Gibbon draws. The Germans, though called barbarians, possessed virtues that Rome itself no longer held in high esteem: courage untainted by calculation, loyalty unbroken by ambition, and a simplicity of manners unspoiled by decadence. Their society may have lacked refinement, but it produced men capable of enduring hardship and war with a tenacity Romans had once admired in themselves. As luxury and public corruption spread through the empire, the Germans appeared almost like a mirror of Rome's forgotten past. The chapter also describes how environmental forces shaped their destiny. Germania's poor soil and harsh climate limited its capacity to support large populations. As tribes grew, they faced a stark choice: internal conflict or outward expansion. Migration thus became a natural outlet, a movement not driven by imperial ambition but by necessity. Each tribe pushed another forward, creating waves of displacement that eventually broke against Rome's borders. These movements, though gradual, hinted at the great tidal wave that would later sweep across Europe. In their encounters with Rome, the Germans learned the strengths and weaknesses of the empire. They witnessed the wealth of the provinces, the splendor of Roman cities, and the abundance of grain, wine, and comforts unknown in their homeland. These wonders awakened desires that life in Germania could never satisfy. The lure of Roman riches became irresistible. What they could not gain through trade, they sought through plunder. Yet their greatest asset was the absence of fear. A people who lived without cities had nothing to defend but their honor. A people accustomed to cold and hunger could not be starved into surrender. A people without monarchs could not be decapitated by killing one leader. Rome faced not a single enemy, but a multitude of nations, each capable of rising again no matter how many defeats they suffered. As Gibbon closes the chapter, we sense his conviction that the Germans were not mere raiders, but a rising force shaped by nature and destiny. Rome, weakened by internal division, corruption, and the loss of civic virtue, inevitably ceded ground to a society that possessed the elemental energies of youth. The Germans did not yet seek to conquer the empire, but their movement toward its borders revealed a profound shift in the balance of power. The historian foreshadows that these tribes, at first small, scattered, and underestimated, would someday carve their names into the heart of Europe and into the ruins of Rome itself. Thus, Chapter 9 stands as a prelude to the great transformation of the ancient world. It portrays Germania not as a fringe region of savages, but as a cradle of new nations whose vigor contrasted painfully with Rome's decline. The clash between these two worlds, one declining and one ascendant, would shape the fate of the empire in the centuries to come. Chapter 10: The Emperors Decius, Gallus, Aemilianus, and Valerian. This chapter marks one of the most turbulent passages in Rome's crisis-ridden 3rd century, when emperors rose and fell with alarming speed, and the empire itself seemed caught in a storm of plagues, invasions, rebellions, and political fragility. In recounting the reigns of Decius, Gallus, Aemilianus, and Valerian, the narrative reveals a world where even capable leaders were consumed by forces far greater than personal ambition: the collapse of Roman unity, the growing power of foreign enemies, and the disintegration of the very institutions that had once held the empire together. Decius, the first of these emperors, emerged not as a tyrant seeking glory, but as a reformer determined to restore Rome's ancient discipline. He believed deeply that the empire had declined because it had abandoned the virtues of its ancestors: military courage, civic duty, and loyalty to the traditional gods. When he overthrew Philip, it was with the intention of reawakening Rome's spirit rather than satisfying a personal thirst for power. Yet noble motives could not shield him from the brutal realities of his age. Decius's religious reforms became the most infamous feature of his reign. Convinced that Rome's misfortunes were caused by divine anger at spiritual neglect, he issued a decree requiring all citizens to offer sacrifice to the Roman gods. The measure was meant to unify the empire, but it struck directly at the Christian community, who could not, by conscience, comply. Thus began one of the most powerful persecutions in Roman history, not driven by hatred, but by Decius's unwavering belief that Rome's survival depended on religious conformity. His determination only stiffened the resistance of Christians, creating martyrs whose moral example strengthened the faith he hoped to eradicate. But the gravest danger to Rome lay not in the rising strength of foreign enemies. The Goths, once minor marauders along the Danube, now formed a formidable nation capable of organized warfare. Their incursions into Roman territory were no longer mere raids, but invasions of scale and purpose. Decius, true to his military character, led the legions personally to confront this new threat. The struggle culminated in the disastrous Battle of Abritus. Trapped in marshy ground, the Roman army collapsed, and Decius, refusing to retreat, died in the mud beside his son. His body was lost, and Rome suffered the humiliation of its first emperor slain by barbarians. His death symbolized the harsh truth that Rome could no longer rely on its former invincibility. Gallus, who succeeded Decius, inherited an empire devastated by war and ravaged by plague. The pestilence that swept across the empire drained its population, shattered its economy, and crippled the army's capacity to defend the frontiers. In such desperation, Gallus chose negotiation over confrontation. He signed a treaty with the Goths that allowed them to keep their spoils and even promised them annual payments. What earlier emperors would have considered an unthinkable disgrace became for Gallus a bitter necessity. Yet the people saw only weakness, and the army grew restless. During this fragile moment, a new figure rose: Aemilianus, commander of the frontier legions in Moesia. Having repelled a Gothic incursion, he was hailed as a savior by his soldiers, who blamed Gallus for Rome's prior humiliation. The legions proclaimed Aemilianus emperor, and he marched swiftly toward Italy. Gallus attempted to resist, but the loyalty of his troops dissolved. He and his son were killed by their own soldiers before they ever reached safety. Such was the fate of emperors whose power depended entirely on an army that no longer respected tradition or legitimacy. Aemilianus himself enjoyed only weeks of authority. As he advanced toward Rome, Valerian, an experienced statesman commanding the Rhine legions, was proclaimed emperor by his own troops. Aemilianus's soldiers, seeing Valerian's superior position and fearing civil war, murdered their own leader just as they had murdered Gallus. In this cycle of violence, one perceives not only the decline of emperors, but the decline of Rome's political soul. No principle-guided succession, the empire was a prize to be seized by whichever army acted first. Valerian's accession, however, offered a brief glimmer of hope. Unlike his predecessors, he was a man of dignity, age, and experience. He had served the empire faithfully for decades, and his character commanded genuine respect. Yet even for a capable ruler, the empire's crises were overwhelming. With threats erupting simultaneously across the borders, Valerian made the pragmatic decision to divide responsibilities. He assumed command of the east, while his son, Gallienus, was entrusted with defending the west. This division was a concession to reality, a tacit admission that Rome had grown too vast and too troubled for one man to control. Valerian's greatest challenge came from the powerful Sassanid Empire under Shapur I, whose ambition matched the renewed vigor of Persia. While Rome was weakened by decades of internal upheaval, Shapur saw an opportunity to reclaim lands once held by his Persian ancestors. His armies surged across the Euphrates, capturing cities and destroying Roman garrisons. Valerian marched east to confront this threat, but the legions he led were ravaged by plague, weakened by poor supply lines, and demoralized by constant retreat. In a moment that stunned the ancient world, Valerian was seized during a negotiation with Shapur. The Emperor of Rome, once the master of the Mediterranean, was reduced to a Persian captive. Legends claim Shapur used him as a living step-stool when mounting his horse. Though these stories may be exaggerated, the humiliation was real. Never before had a Roman emperor been taken alive by an enemy. Valerian died in captivity, and his skin, it was said, was stuffed with straw and displayed as a trophy. Rome, already struggling, was shaken to its core. An empire that had once feared nothing now feared everything: plague, invasion, rebellion, and the bitter truth that its rulers no longer died peacefully in bed, but in swamps, at the hands of mutinous soldiers, or in foreign chains. Chapter X thus reveals the erosion of Roman stability at every level. The unity of the state collapsed under the pressure of continuous crises. The army, once the disciplined foundation of Roman power, became the maker and destroyer of emperors. Foreign enemies grew stronger as Rome grew weaker. And the emperors themselves, whether noble reformers like Decius, reluctant rulers like Gallus, brief usurpers like Aemilianus, or respected veterans like Valerian, were swept away by the chaos of an age they could not control.